He was a soldier's soldier, decorated for bravery by the British government and respected by the men in his battalion. But war had taken its toll on him, and he felt a deep-seated resentment against his country's military campaign. His name was Siegfried Sassoon, and he came from the trenches of hell in World War I to fight another battle in the halls of government at home.
I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers.
He felt that the war was wholly wrong in every way, and that it was his duty to speak out against it.
His resentment of the war took the form of poems, searing indictments that ran counter to popular opinion.
His poetry actually made people think about war in a totally different way. Nobody had presented war in the way that Sassoon did.
Tomorrow night we trudge up to the trenches, and my boots are rotten. 5 miles of stodgy clay and freezing sludge, and everything but wretchedness forgotten.
He might be one of the best ways of introducing yourself to the sound, the sight, the smell, the fear, etc. of what war is really about.
This is the story of how one man's poetry and his protest against World War I shined a light of truth on the subject of war and forever seared that conflict in the memory of his country. On a hot August day in 1914, Siegfried Sassoon went off to enlist in war without the slightest idea of what lay ahead. And the rest of his countrymen were as innocent as he was. Germany had invaded Belgium, and war fever ran high. It was every able British man's duty to fight against Germany and her allies.
Everybody signed up thinking, hurrah, hurrah, we're going to purify the blood and have a little war, set ourselves to go home by Christmas.
Like the hundreds of thousands of other recruits, Siegfried Sassoon was eager to enlist. But nothing in Sassoon's sheltered life prepared him for what he was about to face, or for the transformation that he was about to undergo. In 1886, Siegfried Sassoon was born into a comfortable, upper-class home, far from the conflicts of the outside world.
He was quite well-to-do in terms of money. He was someone who had been brought up with his mother in a very close family, and he'd not really been exposed to any kind of harshness in terms of the environment or his life. Or, everything was there for him, and his mother made sure he had everything.
After his father's early death, his mother raised her 3 boys in Kent, in the English countryside. Less than a year separated Siegfried and his younger brother Hamo, and as young men, they spent time hunting, golfing, and playing tennis. Siegfried also fancied himself a poet, and he enjoyed composing romantic verses. But one critic noted that Sassoon's early work was musical, grandiloquent, and mindless.
I've listened, and all the sounds I heard were music, wind and stream and bird. With youth who sang from hill to hill, I've listened. My heart is hungry still.
Up until the war, there is no social comment in his work at all. It's about fox hunting and steeplechasing and, basically having a good time in that Edwardian society. And his writing at the beginning, then, was almost like his life. It was very flowery. One might even say florid.
By the time he turned 25, Sassoon's poetry had not matured, nor had Sassoon.
He was bored stiff and felt he was never going to make himself a great poet if he just stayed in Kent. And he wanted to go to London.
In 1914, Sassoon went to London to try his hand as a poet, but all of England was abuzz with news of impending war. Everyone was signing up, and Sassoon got caught up in the war fervor. 9 months after enlisting, he became an officer in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He joined the ranks of soldiers who would write about their direct experiences in the war and become known as the war poets.
For the first time, the writing and the fighting classes were one and the same. If you think about World War I, it was the first mobilization, the first really big call-up. So there were masses of people that were being brought into this experience, and a lot of them wrote. And there were, huge numbers of memoirs, a lot of poems written, tremendous amount of poetry written, and most of that poetry was pro-war.
Sassoon was quick to jump on the patriotic bandwagon and wrote a poem entitled France.
And they are fortunate who fight for gleaming landscapes swept and shafted, and crowned by cloud pavilions white, hearing such harmonies as might only from heaven be downward wafted, voices of victory and delight.
The harsh reality of war suddenly hit home with the arrival of a grim telegram. Sassoon's beloved brother Hamo had been killed during the Battle of Gallipoli. The loss of his brother hit Sassoon hard.
It brought out something new in him to understand the personal loss, that put the war in the context of the individual. Men are killed one by one, and families suffer one by one. And the reality of war really only comes home to us when we see the one by one being brought home.
On the 25th of November, 1915, Sassoon was given a platoon of 60 men. His unit was stationed at a supply depot not far from the front lines. Blasts from the artillery shells roared in the distance, and the wounded coming off of the battlefield passed by Sassoon's unit non-stop. Sassoon kept an almost daily diary, and his journal entries reflected his new experiences as a soldier.
November 24th, about 4:30. Flares go up frequently. A few shells go high overhead. The trenches are very wet. November 27th. Go out again, starting at 9:45 p.m. in brilliant moonlight and iron frost. Dig from 12 to 2. Home at 4:15.
His diary entry sharpened his writing style, but so too would a fellow officer fresh from the front lines, Robert Graves.
Both of them were physically very notable. I mean, Sassoon was about 6'2", gangling, awkward, big ears, but a very noble head. So he was kind of an unmistakable presence, as was Robert Graves. So they were two very striking people, and they immediately became very good friends.
And this is rather a remarkable thing in the middle of war, that these two men, who were both genuinely poets, actually made contact with each other and became friends. So they understood each other in a way that if one of them hadn't been a writer, and particularly a poet, would never have happened.
Graves and Sassoon's friendship was based on poetry and prose, and they exchanged drafts of their poems to critique.
Poetry was not something that was a usual topic for discussion, and so they developed their own special code. When they wanted to talk about poems, Graves would say to Sassoon that he wanted to talk to him about a recipe he had for rum punch, and that was the signal that they would go off and talk about their poetry with each other.
Though Sassoon and Graves were drawn to each other through their poetry, their writing styles were very different. Graves's verse was gritty and real, colored by his experiences fighting in the trenches.
Down in the mud I lay, tired out by my long day of 5 damned days and nights, 5 sleepless days and nights. Dreams snatched and set me where the dungeon of despair looms over desolate sea, frowning and threatening me.
But Sassoon hadn't seen trench warfare yet.
Sassoon wrote a poem which began, "Return to greet me, colours that were my joy." It was all terribly overblown, whereas Robert was writing stuff about what was really going on in the trenches, which Sassoon hadn't at that point seen. So Sassoon was trying to be quite nice to Robert, but he was saying to him, well, Robert, I mean, you know, this stuff, it's a little bit grim. It's not really quite nice, is it? But Robert, on the other hand, thought that Sassoon's poetry was absolutely ridiculous because it didn't address what was actually happening in the trenches at all.
Graves and Sassoon formed a friendship with another officer, David Thomas. Sassoon felt a particularly close connection with Thomas, whom he met while training outside of Liverpool.
He met a young man there, a younger officer than himself, to whom he was attracted. I mean, he was emotionally and physically attracted to this person.
When David Thomas was killed, an unfortunate bullet which got him in the throat and he died a few hours later, that made a very big difference, both to Sassoon and to Graves.
It was the death of David Thomas that really was deeply traumatic experience for both of them. They were used to death and used to seeing people die, but it was the first time that they really lost somebody who they deeply loved.
Today I knew what it means to find the soul washed pure with tears, and the load of death was lifted from my heart. So I wrote his name in chalk on the beech tree stem, and left a garland of ivy there, and a yellow primrose for his yellow hair, and kind grey eyes. My dear, my dear.
Suddenly, the illusions were over. This was reality. Kent and horses, and that was not reality. That was playtime. This was serious matters.
Only a week after the death of David Thomas, Sassoon's battalion was posted to the front lines in France's Valley of the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles in the war. Life in the frontline trenches was horrific. The numbers of wounded mounted with each hour of battle. All around were the twisted scenes of death. Sassoon captured the brutal landscape of the front lines in a poem called The Redeemer.
Darkness. The rain sluiced down. The mire was deep. It was past 12 on a midwinter night, when peaceful folk in beds lay snug asleep. There, with much work to do before the light, we lugged out clay-sucked boots as best we might. Along the trench, sometimes a bullet sang, and droning shells burst with a hollow bang. We were soaked, chilled, and wretched every one. Darkness, the distant wink of a huge gun.
With a poem called The Redeemer, which is his first major war poem, he began to find his own voice within the context of war.
At the Somme, Sassoon's grief for his brother Hamo and for David Thomas put an end to any ambivalence that he may have felt about killing the enemy.
I used to say I couldn't kill anyone in this war, but since they killed Tommy, I would gladly stick a bayonet into a German by daylight.
Sassoon began to take enormous, life-threatening risks. For his daring attacks, Sassoon was given the name Mad Jack.
He began taking the most frightful risks, no longer careful of his own life at all, and on one occasion, it was quite amazing when you think of the dangers of trench warfare, he single-handedly, quite amazing this, he bombed his way single-handedly into a trench full of Germans and sent them all running.
For his fearless actions on the battlefield, Sassoon was awarded the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest honors. Sassoon and Robert Graves survived the Battle of the Somme, but by the time it was over, 5 months later, more than 500,000 Allied soldiers were either wounded or dead.
on the first day alone. Almost 60,000 British casualties. And it was after losses like that they had seen so much carnage that they really wanted to do what they could to stop what was going on.
With military conscription now mandatory at home, some English civilians also began to wonder if the war was a noble cause.
What in earlier days had been drafts of volunteers were now droves of victims. I was just beginning to be aware of this.
Because of his experience at the front lines and his friendship with Robert Graves, Sassoon had changed, and his poetry had too. Sassoon's unflinching poems were being published in a few London newspapers and had caught the attention of influential people who opposed the war.
People like Graves and Sassoon developed a frustration with what their family and friends were reading and thinking back home about what was going on in France and what was really going on. And so they used the poems that they wrote about the direct experience in a way deliberately designed to shock people, wake them up.
Sassoon was out there, and he was writing poetry, marvelous poetry, but declaiming it or putting it just like graffiti on a wall. It was so raw.
The first anti-war poem of Sassoon's to stir up controversy was called In the Pink. It paints the picture of a soldier daydreaming about happier times at home and concludes,
Tomorrow night we trudge up to the trenches, and my boots are rotten. 5 miles of stodgy clay and freezing sludge, and everything but wretchedness forgotten. Tonight he's in the pink, but soon he'll die.
Sassoon's readers were drawn to the biting satire of his new poetry, but some conservative publishers found the poems to be too harsh.
There was a board, a censorship board, that really passed on everything that went on in English newspapers, English journals, and so on and so forth. So what people were allowed to read at home was circumscribed by what was allowed to come through by the government.
And indeed, some of the papers that previously had been prepared to print his poems actually stopped because they thought it would not be helpful to recruiting. So they said, we mustn't publish those poems. We're going to stop the young lads coming to sign. So, I mean, that's a huge impact, isn't it, on public thinking.
The grim trenches of the battlefield were a short trip across the English Channel, only a few hours from London. Sassoon and his soldiers made periodic trips back home as fresh troops were rotated in.
And then he'd go to London, and he'd find people enjoying themselves, going about as if nothing really was happening over there. Or if it was happening over there, it was happening because these men were very brave and they didn't mind doing it. And I think they had the idea that it was all clean and wonderful.
Sassoon often found it more difficult to be away from the front lines than not. The contrast between the two worlds, the romantic view of the war from home versus the unimaginable hell at the front, tormented Sassoon and pushed him to put an even sharper edge on his poetry.
Sassoon felt that he should be writing poems which were expressing outrage and anger at behaviour of the politicians and the older generation back home who were waving the flags and thinking it was all a great thing to be doing, a great adventure.
Sassoon wrote about this upper class urging on the glorious sacrifice from their private club in London in his poem called The Fathers.
Snug at the club 2 fathers sat, gross, goggle-eyed and full of chat. One of them said, "My eldest lad writes cheery letters from Baghdad, but Arthur's getting all the fun at Arras with his 9-inch gun." "Yes," wheezed the other, "that's the luck. My boy's quite broken-hearted, stuck in England training all this year. Still, if there's truth in what we hear, the Huns intend to ask for more before they bolt across the Rhine." I watched them toddle through the door, these impotent old friends of mine.
It seemed to Sassoon that the world, or at least England, had gone mad.
Sassoon developed a concern that the war was never going to be won by any one side, and that politicians had an agenda of their own which was not being revealed. He felt that he'd been betrayed by the people he'd been fighting for.
Sassoon's view of the war had completely changed in the 2 years since he first enlisted, but the public still believed it was a worthy cause.
And I think it was partly why soldiers had such a difficult time when they came home. People simply did not understand what they had been through.
In April of 1917, not long after returning to the front lines, Sassoon was shot through the shoulder by a sniper. He continued to lead his men until he was relieved of his post, then walked 4 miles back to a field hospital where he could be treated. He was sent home to England to heal, but Sassoon's recuperation only gave him more time to think. He spent time at Garsington Manor, the home of Lady Ottoline Morel, an outspoken pacifist and opponent of the war, as was her husband, a member of Parliament.
At Garsington, the war was described as being waged for unworthy motives, and it was the duty of a courageous minority to stand out against the public opinion which supported its continuance and prolongation. I was at last learning the truth about what was happening behind the political scenes. It was the beginning of a process of disillusionment.
One of the regular guests at Garsington was the pacifist Bertrand Russell. He quickly identified Sassoon as a bright, decorated, but frustrated soldier who might be willing to speak out against the war.
They were trying to persuade him, you can do more than write poems.
With help from the Morels and Bertrand Russell, Sassoon drafted a letter of protest to his commanding officers, telling them that he was opposed to the continuance of the war and that he wasn't coming back.
He was absent without leave because he was supposed to have reported back, and he said he didn't care. Just wrote to his commanding officers, "I'm not coming back," he said.
While walking on the banks of the Mersey River, Sassoon ripped his Military Cross medal from his uniform and threw it in. Bertrand Russell saw Sassoon's letter of protest as a publicity coup for the anti-war movement and convinced him that the statement should be addressed to the heads of state as well. On July 30th, 1917, Sassoon's letter of protest was read aloud to members of Parliament in the British House of Commons.
I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, may now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a part to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust.
I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority. Well, that was going to get him in trouble right away. Willful defiance of military authority. Because what's the most important thing for a second lieutenant to do? It's to obey orders. He says, I am a soldier, convinced that I'm acting on behalf of soldiers. It mattered a great deal to him, these soldiers that he really felt were being put in his care. He goes on to say, I am not protesting against the military conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. And that's the key thing.
Sassoon was ready to face the consequences. In fact, he wanted a military hearing so that his protest would be widely heard. But the punishment for his actions was much more serious than he had imagined.
To disobey your officer, to be disobedient, to be insubordinate, anything like that, was death. He was shot. There was no mercy, he was shot. And he went through a terrible period of maltreatment before that. So all Sassoon's friends could see that there was going to be terrible consequences for their friend.
At what seemed to be the last moment, Sassoon's best friend, Robert Graves, stepped in and maneuvered to save him.
Robert Graves intervened and said the boy is crazy, not a dangerous radical. What he really needs is a medical board to certify him. He needs to be hospitalized, not to be put in jail.
Graves then convinced Sassoon that the military had no intention of publicizing his case through a court-martial. Sassoon reluctantly agreed to go before a medical board, which ruled that he was suffering from shell shock and that he should be sent away to Craig Lockhart Hospital.
Craig Lockhart was this really wonderful old Scottish mansion, which was the hospital for soldiers who had experienced shell shock. During the day, they try to keep them busy. But at night, what you're hearing after the doors are closed are the sounds of the soldiers screaming in their nightmares.
Sassoon was assigned to work with Dr. William Rivers, one of the leading psychologists working with shell shock patients. Rivers had a good relationship with his patients and utilized Freudian psychotherapy to unlock the deep-seated damage done by the war.
It was about talking through understanding the deeper impulses that were going through the minds and the emotions of the men he was dealing with.
I think that Rivers represented for Sassoon an audience. He knew if he sat back and let him talk, the healing was in the talking.
Dr. Rivers encouraged Sassoon to use his poetry as part of his therapy.
Dr. Rivers made Sassoon begin to think that when you were writing a poem, you were addressing a particular emotional problem, and in the course of writing the poem, you worked out what that problem was and solved it.
Once he got there, he wrote some of his most wonderful war poetry because it'd given him time now to collate all his experiences. And he wrote some of these stunning war poems that we remember today.
In response to his new environment and the shattered lives around him, Sassoon wrote Survivors.
No doubt they'll soon get well. The shock and strain have caused their stammering, disconnected talk. Of course they're longing to go out again, these boys with old, scared faces, learning to walk.
At Craig Lockhart, Sassoon read the regular reports sent back from his platoon in the battlefield and began to feel that he had abandoned his men.
And I think that's what many soldiers feel in a situation like that. It would be very wrong for me just to cut and run and leave all these people out there fighting by themselves. So my place is with my men.
After 4 months in the hospital, he made a decision that would shock those who knew him. He returned to the battlefields to fight once more in a war that he loathed, in which so many would die. Siegfried Sassoon would survive World War I and live into his 80s, writing 6 autobiographies and more than 10 volumes of poetry, much of it an attempt to put the war into some kind of perspective.
He was of that generation that let us know that this was a terrible business, the world's worst wound, and that he was a direct witness of that and someone who really spoke about it.
War poetry flourished during the First World War, a kind of poetic war correspondence that captured the horrors of that grim experience. The voice of Siegfried Sassoon and the other war poets would go down in history, struggling above the madness to be heard.